A long time ago, in the American frontier, there lived a presence of evil. A presence that terrorized the wilderness of rural towns across the South. This is the story of America's first serial killers. This is the story of the Harps. Micaiah, also known as Big Harp, was the son of John Harp, a Scottish immigrant to Orange County, North Carolina. John's brother William Harp had a son named Joshua, who became known as Wiley, or Little Harp.
The Harps were actually first cousins. Big Harp, Micaiah, his dad was Jonathan Harp, who immigrated to this part of the U.S. into North Carolina from Scotland. His brother, William Harp, also immigrated at the same time, and he had a son, and that was Joshua Harp, who became known as Little Harp. So they were first cousins, but they would pass themselves off as brothers all the time, and that's where the confusion came in.
I would call them an efficient killing machine. They were men that could kill and seemed to have no conscience.
The Harps were our first original serial killing family. They were also credited with cannibalism, incest, pretty much anything that you could come up with that somebody did that they didn't like. Everyone assumed that they had done that. If it happened, the Harps must have done it, and they usually did.
Micaiah and Wiley Harp grew up on the farm. As far as we can tell, they were probably homeschooled. I don't know about Micaiah, but we do know that Wiley in later years could sign his name. It has been said that Wiley was actually the brains of the outfit and Micaiah was the brawn.
They preyed on the weak. You had individuals who were planning to settle on the frontier, had all the gold and silver they probably had in this world and a few possessions. Oftentimes they didn't care about the possessions other than the gold and the silver. They were like chameleons. Evidently they could play a preacher on one occasion and then get drunk that night and throw a man over a cliff.
One thing is, once you were west of the Appalachia, you were in the wilderness. It was just called the wilderness. That's because there was no protection. There were very few forts or blockades out there. And so if you were a traveler along the different trails, you would have to stay in like people's homes that would function as kind of like roadside inns. They stopped at one called the Seagull House. While they were at the Seagull House, Mrs. Seagull's baby started crying in the middle of the night. So Big Harp got up, walked over into the room where the baby was, pulled his knife, and slit its throat. Mrs. Seagull saw that, started screaming. He grabbed her, slit her throat. On the way back to his room to go to sleep after this, he heard another traveler in a room that was snoring, so he went in and killed him too. He systematically went through and killed everyone else in the house except for his group, and then just turned back in and went to sleep.
The cousins left North Carolina in 1775 for Virginia to be slave overseers.
As they roamed through the Virginia countryside, they came upon some Tory outlaws and renegade Indians. And after sitting around the campfire with them for a while and listening to their tales of adventure, they decided this is what they wanted to do. They roamed the countryside, they plundered, they pillaged crops, they burnt farmhouses, they raped women, and they took anything they wanted. They just plundered and pillaged all they wanted to.
I think a lot of folks got the idea that you could stay along beside a trail or a river and rob folks and make a whole lot better living you could out plowing the ground. Harp boys evidently figured that out early.
As a rule, the Harps traveled as a family. There were 3 wives, the 2 brothers / first cousins. Numerous children. Of course, they didn't necessarily go on too many trips because I think of the 7 or 8 children they had born, they murdered all but maybe 2.
They had kidnapped Susan Wood, the daughter of Captain James Wood. They had also captured Marie Davidson and Ellen Rice and forced them to be their wives.
They would time to time ally themselves with various factions.
They joined in with the British Army, and they fought at Kings Mountain, the Battle of Blackstock, and the Battle of Cowpens near the North Carolina-South Carolina border.
The British Army didn't have enough troops to really patrol and corral the settlers out in the wilderness, so they struck deals with several tribes that was pretty much, we'll back you up, you just handle anybody out there. And so the Harps joined in with them and participated in several conflicts on the wilderness. They then moved to Knoxville. And at that time, they were taken into the regular Tory forces of the Army. And they did that for about a year only. And after a couple of defeats, especially at Cowpens, they left and joined back up with several of the Cherokee that had joined them before in their renegade actions. And they started hitting settlements in Kentucky, Tennessee area. They even attacked Station Bluff, which is what Nashville became.
Just anything they wanted to do, they got by with.
The Harps had no value for human life. No one was safe from them. Not even their own families.
Susan and Marie both had 2 children each from the Harps. All 4 of those children were murdered by Big Harp and Little Harp, mainly Big Harp.
It didn't take much to set them off. A cry, a whimper, just something you said, something you did. Big Harp would pick up a kid and just slam him against a tree, head first, brain him.
Up near Henderson, Kentucky, they actually got captured. And they were being held, but the 2 Harps managed to escape. The women were held. And so once the women were released, they were escorted out of town and given a horse. By a lot of historical accounts, the first thing they did is they traded the horse for a canoe and went looking for their husbands. That's how broken in spirit they were. And when they escaped, they made their way to a place called the Cave in the Wall, which is on the Illinois side of the Ohio River. And it was the notorious river pirate hangout. It was where the famous river pirate, Samuel Mason, based his group of river pirates. He was a Rev War hero that had turned river pirate. So when the Harps joined, they became much more brutal. In fact, they stayed with them for several years until the river pirates asked them to leave. Because the Harps' favorite game after they would seize a flatboat with travelers was they would steal all the goods, they would rape the women right there in front of everybody for their own enjoyment. And then their favorite game was to take them up onto the bluffs, strip them naked, and throw them off the bluffs. And this was unsettling to the river pirates. I mean, how messed up an individual do you be for a river pirate to say, you need to move on?
One of the first victims we know of was a man named Moses Doss. He was actually one of the Harps gang members. Moses made some comments about the way the Harps were treating their women. They didn't like his comments, so one of them walked up behind him and cut his throat. They threw him to the ground, they took their tomahawks, and just hacked him to pieces.
As the killings grew and panic spread, a posse was formed to apprehend the Harps.
Joseph Ballinger and his group of regulators cornered the Harps in a canebrake. It was almost dark, so the posse was afraid to go in after dark. So they waited till daybreak, and the Harps made their escape that night. And one of the posse members by the name of Henry Skaggs got mad because the way the posse acted by not going in and showing their cowardice. He went to a nearby house where Daniel Trabue lived. He was a Kentucky colonel. He wanted to raise another posse. As they sat there discussing what took place, Trabue's hound dog came limping into the yard, covered with blood and badly wounded. The bad part was the dog came in the yard alone. The dog had left earlier that morning with Colonel Trabue's young son, Johnny. A search was made for Johnny, and they couldn't find him. 2 weeks later, little Johnny's dismembered body was found in a sinkhole.
They killed a 13-year-old boy in Kentucky. The governor offered a $300 reward on their head. And that's really what began to become their downfall. They began to chase them. They were actually captured at one point somewhere near Danville, Kentucky, were put in prison. They escaped, left their women.
Harps Hill is the exact location isn't precisely known, but it's near Dixon, Kentucky. And that is actually where Big Harp met his end.
Big Harp was killed at that time by his head being severed.
The posse tracked him down, shot him, Colonel Trabot pulled Big Harp's knife and cut his head off.
He even egged on the people that captured him, and he just picked apart their inability to kill people. He told the colonel that it took you 4 times longer to cut my head off, and then I cut anybody's off. I mean, he was just mean to the end.
They left the body where it laid on the ground, and it became known as Harp's Hill. And so, Little Harp, Wiley, he escaped and got away. He actually went and joined back up with the river pirate Samuel Mason, and that's where he hid out for years.
Little Harp met the same fate when he took the head of an outlaw to a sheriff's station to claim the reward money.
Wiley, for being as smart as he was, also was an idiot. Little Harp killed Mason, or he may have died from the wounds in the escape, but he cut the head off, walked into the sheriff's office in Natchez, Mississippi, and said, "Here is the head of the famous river pirate, Sam Mason. Where's my money?"
It just happened there was a man from Kentucky that recognized Little Harp, and instead of him getting his reward, he was imprisoned. Little Harp was killed in Greenville, Mississippi. His head was cut off, and his head was impaled to a tree also.
The only real answer to why the Harps went on a killing spree is that they were sociopaths. And that's different than a psychopath. A psychopath is like a junkie. They have to kill to get a fix. And that can go on so long until they have to get another fix.
The Harps will remain as some of America's most dangerous outlaws.